A billionaire's betrayal or the ultimate love story? Ryan Lancaster had everything: wealth, power, and a future written in stone. But when his family forces him into an arranged marriage with a woman he's never met, he refuses to be a pawn in their game. Determined to take control of his own fate, he escapes into the city, where he meets her, a mysterious, sharp-witted woman who seems refreshingly real in a world full of deception. But what happens when the truth shatters everything? When the woman he thought was his escape turns out to be the very person he was running from? Love, power, betrayal. Nothing is what it seems in this high-stakes game of heart and legacy. Subscribe now and don't miss the drama, the secrets, and the twists that will leave you speechless. Ryan Lancaster had everything a man could ask for: wealth, power, and a name that carried weight in every elite social circle of New York City. As the only son of the Lancaster family, he had been groomed since birth to inherit Lancaster Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate with interests in real estate, finance, and luxury goods. His father, Charles Lancaster, was a titan of industry, a man whose word was law, and his mother, Victoria Lancaster, was a socialite with an iron grip on high society. From the outside, Ryan's life seemed perfect, but perfection came at a price. Every aspect of his life had been carefully orchestrated by his parents: the schools he attended, the friends he made, the business ventures he pursued. Even his relationships were subject to scrutiny. Love to the Lancasters was nothing more than a strategic alliance. And now they had made their most ambitious move yet, arranging his marriage to the daughter of the Sullivan family, another corporate dynasty that controlled a vast empire. Ryan had never met her. He barely knew anything about her, other than the fact that their union would consolidate two of the most powerful business empires in the country. That was enough for his parents. But for him, it wasn't. At dinner one evening, in the grand dining room of the Lancaster estate, his father dropped the news with the casual authority of a business transaction. "You will marry Jennifer Sullivan," Charles announced, his deep voice echoing against the marble walls. "It's already been discussed. The papers will be signed next week." Ryan set down his glass of wine and exhaled sharply. He had expected this conversation for years, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. "You're joking," he said, though he knew his father never joked about business. "I don't joke," Charles replied, his sharp gaze pinning Ryan to his seat. "This is not up for debate." Ryan turned to his mother, who merely adjusted her diamond bracelet and offered a serene smile. "It's what's best for the family, darling," Victoria said smoothly. "For you as well. Jennifer comes from a respectable lineage, and she will make a fine wife." "I don't even know her," Ryan protested, pushing his chair back slightly. "You expect me to marry a complete stranger? Like this is the 18th century?" His father sighed, shaking his head. "Love is a childish notion, Ryan. Marriage is about power. You've been given everything, and now it's time to play your part." Ryan clenched his fists under the table. He had always known he was a pawn in his parents' endless game of corporate chess. But this was too much. He wasn't about to let them dictate his future so easily. "I'm not doing it," he declared, standing up. "If I get married, it'll be because I chose to, not because of some business deal." Charles's eyes darkened, his voice turning cold. "If you refuse, you risk everything: your inheritance, your position. Do you really think you can walk away from this family and still have the life you do now?" Ryan hesitated for only a second before straightening his shoulders. "Then I'll build a life on my own." His mother let out a soft, disapproving sigh. "Ryan, don't be dramatic." But he had already made up his mind. He wouldn't be another Lancaster puppet. If his parents thought they could dictate his heart, they were wrong. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the table, ignoring the weight of his father's glare on his back. For the first time in his life, Ryan was going to take control. And if that meant losing everything, so be it. The days that followed were filled with tense silence and cold stares. Ryan knew his father well enough to understand that Charles Lancaster was not a man who accepted defiance lightly. His refusal to comply with the arranged marriage had not just been a disappointment, it had been an insult. The confrontation came sooner than expected. One evening, as Ryan returned home from a long drive, his only means of clearing his head, he found his parents waiting for him in his father's office. The study was an imposing space, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes and artifacts from his father's international business trips. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center, behind which Charles Lancaster stood, arms crossed, face unreadable. Victoria sat elegantly in one of the plush leather chairs, sipping from a crystal glass of wine as if this were nothing more than a routine family meeting. "Sit," Charles ordered. Ryan sighed but complied, sinking into the chair across from his father. He could feel the weight of the confrontation pressing down on him before a single word was spoken. "I'll get straight to the point," Charles said, his voice devoid of emotion. "If you refuse to go through with this marriage, you are no longer a Lancaster." Ryan's body tensed, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," Charles continued, his tone clipped and efficient, "that you will be cut off from the family. Completely." Victoria set her glass down and leaned forward slightly. "No more trust fund. No more access to Lancaster Enterprises. Your name will be removed from all legal documents, and your shares will be redistributed. You will not just walk away from this family, Ryan. You will be erased from it." Ryan clenched his jaw. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated such a brutal ultimatum. "You'd really disown your only son over this?" he asked, bitterness creeping into his voice. "This isn't just about you," Charles replied, his expression hard. "This is about the empire we've built. You were born into this family with responsibilities. If you won't uphold them, then you have no place here." Ryan swallowed the anger bubbling in his chest. "So I either marry a stranger or lose everything?" Victoria sighed dramatically as if exhausted by his childishness. "Darling, you're acting as if we're sentencing you to death. Jennifer Sullivan is an intelligent, well-bred woman. You'll learn to care for her, I'm sure." Ryan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "That's not how love works, Mother." His father's patience had clearly run out. "Love is an illusion, Ryan. Power is real, and you either embrace that or throw your life away on a foolish dream." The finality in his father's voice sent a cold wave through him. He wasn't bluffing. If Ryan walked away from this marriage, he would be walking away from everything he had ever known. He left the study without another word, his mind racing. He had always dreamed of freedom, but the reality of it was suffocating. No money, no resources, no connections. Could he really start over from nothing? Lying awake that night in his penthouse suite, staring at the glittering skyline of Manhattan, Ryan felt trapped. For the first time in his life, he had to make a choice that had nothing to do with what was expected of him, and everything to do with what kind of man he wanted to be. The city lights blurred into streaks as Ryan drove aimlessly through Manhattan, his mind heavy with frustration. The suffocating weight of his father's ultimatum pressed down on him, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly lost. He had spent years resenting the invisible chains his family had placed on him. But now, facing the reality of losing everything, he wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of exile. He found himself in Brooklyn, far from the polished skyscrapers and exclusive lounges he usually frequented. The streets here were different, grittier, more alive in a way that the sterile world of the elite never was. Without much thought, he pulled into a dimly lit side street and parked near a small bar tucked between a record store and an old bookstore. A neon sign flickered above the entrance, its glow casting a soft blue hue onto the damp pavement. Ryan wasn't sure what had drawn him here, but he didn't care. He just needed a drink. Inside, the bar was nothing like the lavish, high-end establishments he was used to. It was small and unpretentious, with wooden floors that creaked slightly underfoot and a lingering scent of whiskey and old vinyl records. A low hum of conversation filled the space, accompanied by the occasional clink of glass against wood. He made his way to the counter and slid onto a bar stool, exhaling deeply. The place was comfortably quiet, no pretense, no one here who recognized his last name or cared about his family's empire. "Rough night?" Ryan glanced up at the sound of the voice. Behind the bar stood a woman, wiping a glass with a rag, her eyes sharp and assessing. She wasn't what he expected. She had an air of confidence, but there was something else beneath it. something unreadable. Unlike the women he usually encountered, who draped themselves in designer labels and calculated charm, she seemed entirely at ease in her surroundings. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose bun, a few strands framing her face, and her jeans and black tank top were simple but well-worn. She looked real. Ryan let out a dry chuckle. That obvious? She shrugged, setting the glass down. Most people don't come in here alone unless they're trying to escape something. Ryan studied her for a moment, debating whether to respond with his usual polished indifference or something closer to the truth. He surprised himself by choosing the latter. Let's just say I'm reevaluating some things, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. She arched an eyebrow but didn't press him. Instead, she reached for a bottle of whiskey and poured him a drink. Here. First one's on the house. Ryan frowned. That's not really how businesses make money. She smirked, leaning slightly against the bar. Consider it a welcome gift. You don't seem like a regular. I'm not, he said, taking a sip of the whiskey. It burned, but in a way that felt grounding. She tilted her head, watching him with mild curiosity. So what brings you to this side of town? Lost? Ryan chuckled under his breath. Something like that. She didn't push for more, which he appreciated. Instead, she simply nodded and moved to serve another customer, leaving him to his thoughts. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ryan wasn't being judged, scrutinized, or expected to play a role. He was just a man sitting at a bar talking to a stranger, and he found that strangely comforting. Ryan found himself returning to the bar more often than he intended. At first, he convinced himself it was just because the place was quiet, a welcome escape from the suffocating world he came from. But deep down, he knew it was because of her. He still didn't know her name. She never offered it, and he never asked. It was an unspoken agreement between them, an anonymity that he found oddly refreshing. In his world, introductions always came with expectations: business alliances, strategic friendships, calculated relationships. Here, he was just Ryan, not Ryan Lancaster, heir to an empire. The first time he came back, she merely smirked as he took his usual seat at the bar. Back for another existential crisis? She teased, pouring him a drink. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. Something like that. Their conversations were easy, flowing naturally in a way that felt unfamiliar to him. She had a sharp wit, never hesitating to challenge him, and she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. Unlike the polished socialites he had grown up around, she didn't try to impress him or charm her way into his good graces. One night, after a few drinks, he leaned against the bar and studied her as she expertly mixed a cocktail. You don't seem like the type to work in a place like this, he remarked. She raised an eyebrow. And what type do I seem like? I don't know, he admitted. You're different. She smirked. That's not an answer. He exhaled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. You're smart, quick. You don't seem like someone who takes orders from people. She shrugged. Maybe I like the simplicity of it. No board meetings, no office politics, just good drinks and decent conversations. Ryan considered that. It was a perspective he had never allowed himself to have. Everything in his life had always been about more. More power, more influence, more responsibility. The idea of choosing something just because it made you happy was almost foreign to him. One evening, a well-dressed man wandered into the bar, clearly out of place. He took one look at Ryan and did a double-take before approaching. Ryan Lancaster? The man asked, his tone a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Ryan stiffened, already anticipating the shift in dynamic. The man introduced himself as an investment banker, someone who had attended one of his father's high-profile galas. As the conversation veered toward business, Ryan felt the familiar weight of expectation creeping back in. Then she interrupted. Hey, she called out casually, placing another drink in front of Ryan. Didn't you say you were here to escape work talk? The banker hesitated, then chuckled awkwardly. Right. Well, it was nice running into you. Ryan watched as the man walked away, then turned back to her with amusement. That was subtle. She smirked, wiping down the counter. You looked like you needed an out. Ryan shook his head, smiling. You really don't care who I am, do you? She met his gaze evenly. Nope. Should I? That was the moment he realized why he kept coming back. She saw him, not the legacy, not the name, not the future CEO, just him. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. Ryan had always known exactly where his life was headed. Every step, every decision, every relationship had been carefully curated to serve a greater purpose. The Lancaster name, the family empire, the legacy he was supposed to uphold. Love, as his father often reminded him, was nothing more than a fleeting distraction. But now, sitting at the bar in Brooklyn for what felt like the 100th time, he found himself questioning everything. He watched as she moved effortlessly behind the counter, her hands steady as she poured a drink for another customer. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite define. It wasn't just her confidence or her quick wit, though those things had drawn him in at first. It was the way she existed entirely outside of his world, unburdened by the expectations that weighed him down. With her, he felt like more than just his last name, and that terrified him. Because for the first time in his life, Ryan wanted something that wasn't planned, wasn't expected. He wanted her. It started as an idle thought, a quiet realization in the back of his mind. But the more time he spent with her, the harder it became to ignore. He would catch himself looking forward to their conversations, anticipating the moments when she would challenge him, push him in ways no one else dared to. He liked the way she made him laugh, genuinely laugh, not the polite, measured chuckle he gave at corporate events. And yet, no matter how much he wanted to believe he had control over his own life, reality had other plans. One night, as they sat in a quiet lull between customers, she leaned against the bar and gave him a curious look. "You always look like you're thinking too hard," she mused. "What's on your mind?" Ryan hesitated, swirling the drink in his glass before finally answering. "What if you wanted something you knew you couldn't have?" She smirked, resting her chin on her hand. "That depends. Do you really want it? Or do you just like the idea of wanting it?" Her words hit him harder than he expected. Did he really want this? Or was he just rebelling against the life that had already been mapped out for him? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. She nodded as if she understood, but before he could ask what she was thinking, another customer called for her attention. As he watched her walk away, Ryan felt a knot tighten in his chest. He knew the answer, even if he wasn't ready to say it out loud. He wanted her, but he also knew that no matter how much he wanted to pretend otherwise, his time here was borrowed. His parents had made it clear. He was to marry Jennifer Sullivan, a woman he had never met, a deal he had no say in. He was already living on the edge of defiance. How much further was he willing to go before everything came crashing down? The pressure came swiftly, like an iron vice closing around his life. Ryan had ignored the calls at first, letting them go to voicemail, but the texts kept coming. His mother's words were carefully phrased, elegant, polished, but laced with quiet menace. "You've had your time to rebel, darling. Now it's time to do what's right for the family." His father's messages were more direct. "You will be at the Lancaster Sullivan Gala this Saturday. No discussion." Ryan clenched his jaw as he stared at the screen of his phone. He knew this moment was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. His parents weren't the type to negotiate. They were giving him one last chance to fall in line before they followed through on their threat to cut him off completely. And the worst part? They weren't even giving him the courtesy of a real conversation. That evening, he finally caved and called his father. The phone barely rang before Charles picked up. "You've ignored us long enough," his father said coldly. "We need to finalize the announcement." Ryan pinched the bridge of his nose, frustration bubbling beneath his skin. "You act like this is a corporate merger. I haven't even met this woman, and you want me to stand in front of hundreds of people and pretend like this is normal?" Charles let out a short, humorless laugh. "What's normal, Ryan, is that men in our position do what is necessary. This isn't about romance. It's about securing the future." Ryan bit back a sharp reply, knowing it wouldn't make a difference. His father had never seen marriage as anything more than a transaction. He could argue all night, but in the end, the outcome would be the same. His mother's voice cut in, softer but no less insistent. "You will come, Ryan. You will smile. You will be charming, and you will give the press something to talk about." This is not up for debate. Ryan exhaled slowly, gripping his phone tighter. He could hear it in their voices, the finality. If he refused, they wouldn't hesitate to follow through on their threats. And the truth was, he wasn't ready to lose everything. Fine, he said finally, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. I'll be there. Good boy, his mother said, satisfaction evident in her tone. Ryan ended the call without another word. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at the city skyline from his penthouse window. The world outside kept moving, oblivious to the war raging inside him. He had spent the past few weeks feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Free. Talking to her at the bar, stepping outside the suffocating grip of his last name, it had made him believe for a fleeting moment that he could choose a different path. But the Lancasters didn't believe in choices. And now, in just a few days, his fate would be sealed. A few nights before the gala, Ryan found himself back at the bar, though he knew he shouldn't be. If he had any sense, he'd be preparing for the inevitable, choosing a suit, practicing his fake smile, accepting his fate. Instead, he was here again, drawn back by something he couldn't quite explain. Or maybe he could, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. She was behind the bar as always, effortlessly moving between customers, pouring drinks, cracking dry jokes. Ryan had never seen anyone so completely at ease in their own skin. He envied that. As she set a glass of whiskey in front of him, without him having to ask, she gave him a look. You look worse than usual. Ryan let out a dry chuckle. I'll take that as a compliment. She smirked but didn't push. That was one of the things he liked about her. She didn't pry unless he offered. But tonight it was him who asked the questions. You ever think about doing something else? He asked, watching her carefully. She raised an eyebrow. Like what? I don't know, Ryan admitted, swirling the drink in his glass. You don't seem like someone who enjoys taking drink orders from drunk college kids. She let out a soft laugh. And you don't seem like someone who drowns his sorrows in whiskey at a Brooklyn dive bar. Guess we all have our secrets. Ryan studied her for a moment. There was something in the way she said it, something that made him pause. He had spent enough time around people who hid things behind carefully curated facades to recognize when someone was being intentionally vague. And then she slipped. This city's exhausting, she muttered, more to herself than to him. People like... She stopped herself, shaking her head before finishing. People with too much money and not enough soul. They spend their whole lives playing by rules someone else made. Ryan's fingers tightened around his glass. People with too much money. The way she said it, it wasn't just an observation. It was personal. He frowned, watching her more closely. You say that like you know those people. For the briefest second, something flashed in her eyes. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. I know enough, she said smoothly, shrugging it off. Ryan hesitated. Something about the way she spoke, the way she seemed to understand his world without ever admitting to being part of it. It was odd, but before he could press further, she leaned against the counter, changing the subject effortlessly. So what's got you looking like someone just told you your yacht caught on fire? Ryan smirked despite himself. Maybe I'm just thinking about how I have to put on a suit this weekend and pretend to be the perfect son. She tilted her head. Big event? He sighed. A gala. A ridiculous, over-the-top display of wealth and power where people drink champagne and pretend to like each other. I'm supposed to play my part. She nodded as if she understood all too well. And you hate it. Ryan exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Yeah. There was a moment of silence before she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. Then why do you go? Ryan looked at her, at the way she held his gaze like she was daring him to say something honest. I don't have a choice. She studied him for a moment before giving him a small, almost knowing smile. There's always a choice, Ryan. You just have to be willing to pay the price. He should have questioned how she knew his name. He didn't remember telling her, but the words she said lingered longer than the realization did. And for the rest of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that she understood his world far better than she let on. The night of the gala arrived faster than Ryan would have liked. He stood outside the grand ballroom of the Lancaster Hotel, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo with growing irritation. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and power, two things he had been drowning in since birth. He didn't want to be here. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn around and walk out, to disappear into the night and never look back. But he knew that wasn't an option. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You will be at the gala. No discussion." This was more than just an event. It was a public declaration, a spectacle designed to remind the world that the Lancaster and Sullivan families were untouchable, their influence unstoppable. And Ryan was the pawn at the center of it all. He exhaled sharply, straightened his bow tie, and stepped inside. The room was dazzling. Chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings, golden accents reflecting the soft glow of candlelit tables, champagne flutes glimmering in the hands of men and women dressed in designer perfection. Waiters moved seamlessly through the crowd, serving hors d'oeuvres that cost more than most people's rent. Ryan barely noticed any of it. His thoughts were elsewhere. A waiter offered him a glass of champagne and he took it out of habit, his eyes scanning the room. Somewhere in this sea of silk gowns and tailored suits was the woman he was expected to marry. Jennifer Sullivan, the girl he had never met, yet was somehow supposed to spend his life with. Or so he thought. His mother appeared at his side, her presence as poised as ever. "Ryan," she said smoothly, taking his arm, "she'll be here any moment. Behave." He barely had time to roll his eyes before a hush rippled through the crowd. The large double doors at the entrance swung open, and Ryan's world stopped. Standing in the doorway, in a breathtaking midnight blue gown, was her. Not some stranger. Not some faceless Sullivan heiress. The woman he had been coming back to night after night. The bartender who had seen him at his most unguarded. The girl who had laughed at his dry humor, who had challenged him, who had made him feel real for the first time in his life. His Jennifer. His chest tightened as he watched her step forward, her expression carefully composed, but he could see it, the same shock in her eyes that he knew was reflected in his own. She hadn't known. Neither of them had. His grip tightened around the champagne flute as realization hit him with brutal clarity. Every moment they had spent together, every conversation, every glance, they had been unknowingly circling the truth, playing a game they didn't even realize they were part of. His parents moved forward, oblivious to the silent war raging inside him. His father extended a hand toward Jennifer's parents, exchanging pleasantries, while his mother turned to him with an expectant smile. "Well," she whispered, "go greet your fiancé." Ryan's throat went dry. He forced his feet to move, crossing the distance toward her, toward Jennifer. For a split second their eyes met, and in that moment, in the midst of a ballroom filled with power and expectation, everything changed. Jennifer could feel her heart hammering in her chest as she stood frozen in place, her mind racing to catch up with what her eyes were telling her. Ryan. Ryan Lancaster. The man she had spent countless nights talking to. The man she had let see parts of herself she never shared with anyone else. The same man who now stood before her as her fiancé. Her fiancé. The words felt foreign, wrong. This couldn't be happening. Her fingers curled against the smooth fabric of her gown as she struggled to keep her expression composed. But she could see it in Ryan's face, the way his jaw tightened, the fire that flickered in his eyes. He wasn't just surprised. He was angry. He took a step toward her, his voice low, edged with betrayal. "Tell me this isn't real." Jennifer swallowed hard, her own shock making it impossible to form words. Ryan let out a sharp breath, his fingers raking through his hair. "You knew." That snapped her out of her daze. "What?" His glare was sharp, his voice laced with accusation. "You knew who I was, the whole time." Jennifer's stomach twisted. No. No, no, no. He thought she had done this on purpose, that she had been playing him. "Ryan, I swear I didn't." But he shook his head, letting out a hollow laugh. "Of course you did. You said all the right things, acted like you weren't part of this world, made me believe." He exhaled sharply. "God, I actually thought you were different." "Ryan, please." She stepped closer, reaching out instinctively, but he took a step back, his expression unreadable now. the warmth she had grown used to completely gone. She felt panic rise in her chest. She had spent weeks hiding from this exact moment, running from the life her parents tried to force her into. And yet somehow she had still ended up exactly where she had never wanted to be, standing in front of a man who thought she was just another player in this sick game. "Ryan, I didn't know," she said desperately. "I promise you, I had no idea." But Ryan just stared at her, his face unreadable. "I don't believe you." The words hit harder than she expected. Before she could say anything else, before she could fix this, Ryan turned and walked away. Jennifer stood there, frozen, watching the man she had started to care about disappear into the sea of perfectly dressed guests, each one too consumed with their own conversations to notice the world crumbling between them. She had spent so much time trying to escape her fate, but now she realized with a sinking feeling she had never been in control at all. Ryan stormed out of the ballroom, his heart pounding, his thoughts a tangled mess of betrayal and confusion. The air outside was cold against his heated skin, but it did nothing to cool the fury burning inside him. He had spent weeks coming back to that bar, opening up to her in ways he never did with anyone else. He had let his guard down, convinced himself that, for once, he had found someone who didn't see him as a Lancaster first. And now it turned out she wasn't just part of the world he despised. She was at the center of it. Jennifer Sullivan. The name tasted bitter in his mouth. Had she known? Had she sat across from him night after night, listening to him talk about his frustrations, his hatred for his family's control, all while knowing she was the woman they had chosen for him? Had she laughed at him in private, amused by how foolish he was to believe she was different? Ryan clenched his fists, leaning against the cool stone railing of the hotel's balcony. And yet, a part of him, the part he wanted to ignore, whispered that this didn't make sense. The look on her face when their eyes met tonight, the shock in her expression, it had been real. The panic in her voice when she tried to explain, that had been real too. He had spent enough time around liars to know when someone was faking it. And Jennifer. Jennifer had looked just as blindsided as he had been. So why couldn't he just believe her? Ryan exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the edge of the railing. Because believing her meant admitting that none of this was her fault, that she had been as much a pawn in this as he was, that she hadn't betrayed him at all. And if that were true, then the only person he could be angry at was himself, because the truth he had been avoiding for weeks was now staring him in the face. He had fallen for her, not the idea of her, not the thrill of something different. Her, the way she made him laugh without trying, the way she never treated him like someone he wasn't, the way she looked at him like he was just Ryan, not Ryan Lancaster, not the heir to an empire, not a future CEO, just a man trying to figure out his life. He had told himself it wasn't real, that it was just a fleeting escape from the pressures of his world. But now he wasn't sure how to separate himself from it, because despite everything, despite the chaos, the confusion, the heartbreak, he still wanted her. And that terrified him more than anything else. Jennifer sat in the back of the limousine, staring out at the blurred lights of the city, her mind still spinning from the night's revelation. She could still see the way Ryan had looked at her, not with the warmth she had grown used to, but with something colder, sharper. Betrayal. She had lost him before she even had the chance to tell him the truth. For weeks she had convinced herself that she could live outside of the expectations placed on her, that she could be someone else, even if only for a few hours a night behind that bar, away from the carefully curated life her parents had mapped out for her since birth. But tonight had shattered that illusion. She wasn't just some girl he had met by chance. She was Jennifer Sullivan, heiress to one of the wealthiest families in the country. The woman his parents had chosen for him long before either of them had a say in the matter. And now he thought she had known all along. Jennifer leaned back against the leather seat, shutting her eyes for a brief moment before whispering, "Driver, take me to the Lancaster estate." The man hesitated. "Miss Sullivan, your father." "I don't care," she cut in. "Just drive." She wasn't going to let it end like this. When she arrived, the grand Lancaster estate loomed before her, its towering iron gates cold and unwelcoming. Jennifer didn't wait. She stepped out of the car and made her way to the entrance, ignoring the security guards who hesitated before letting her pass. They knew who she was. Everyone in this world did. A butler opened the door, looking surprised. "Miss Sullivan, where is he?" she demanded. The butler hesitated, but she had no patience left. She pushed past him and made her way inside, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. She found Ryan in his father's study, leaning against the grand piano with a drink in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see her, but his expression was unreadable. The anger from before had cooled, but there was still distance between them, like he was bracing himself for another lie. Jennifer swallowed hard, stepping forward. "We need to talk." Ryan let out a quiet, humorless chuckle and took a slow sip of his drink. "Now you want to talk?" "Yes," she said firmly. He studied her for a long moment before setting his glass down. "All right," he said, crossing his arms. "Go ahead. Explain to me how you didn't know who I was this whole time." Jennifer took a deep breath. "Because I didn't. Not until tonight." Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. She forced herself to keep going. "I've spent my whole life trying to escape this world. That bar, it wasn't just a job. It was the only place I could be myself. No expectations, no Sullivan name. Just me." She paused, her voice softer now. "And then you walked in." Ryan's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. "I never planned for this," she continued. "For you, she exhaled. "I just like talking to you. And for once, I thought I had something real." Ryan looked at her then. Really looked at her, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe her. She stepped closer. "I swear, Ryan, if I had known who you were, I would have never—" She stopped herself, realizing what she was about to say. But he caught it. His voice was quieter when he asked, "Never what?" Jennifer swallowed. "I would have never let myself feel the way I do about you." Silence filled the space between them. Ryan didn't move, didn't speak, and for the first time in a long time, Jennifer felt something she wasn't used to: fear. Because this wasn't just about their parents' arrangement anymore. This was about them. Ryan sat down in the leather armchair across from Jennifer, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers loosely clasped together. He had listened to her explanation, but the weight of the night still pressed heavily on him. His anger hadn't fully faded, but it was shifting, no longer fueled by betrayal, but by something more complicated. "You expect me to believe that all of this was just a coincidence?" he asked, his voice quieter than before, but still laced with skepticism. Jennifer sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't expect anything, Ryan. I need you to know the truth." He didn't respond, so she continued. "My whole life I've been told exactly who I should be, what to wear, how to speak, who to associate with. And for as long as I can remember, I did it. I played the part." She paused, her voice bitter now. "The perfect daughter. The polished Sullivan heiress. The future CEO. But it was never really me." Ryan leaned back, watching her carefully. He knew that feeling all too well. Jennifer let out a small, humorless laugh. "Do you know what my mother said when I told her I wanted to design jewelry instead of running the company?" She glanced at him, but didn't wait for an answer. "That's nice, darling, but real power isn't in pretty things. It's in making people bend to your will." Ryan frowned slightly, recognizing the kind of mindset she was raised under. It wasn't so different from what his father always preached. Jennifer exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I couldn't take it anymore. So I left." Ryan arched an eyebrow. "Left?" She nodded. "Not permanently, just enough. I stopped showing up at events, refused to be paraded around like some investment opportunity, and when my parents got tired of fighting me, they let me go under one condition. I had to keep my name out of the press, out of the spotlight. They figured I'd get bored of playing independent and come crawling back." Ryan tilted his head slightly. "So the bar?" She gave a small, almost shy smile. "It was never about the money. It was about feeling like a normal person for once in my life. About being Jennifer, not Jennifer Sullivan. Ryan studied her, his mind piecing together everything she had just told him. She hadn't played him. She had been running, just like he had. He exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "And now we're here," he muttered. Jennifer nodded, her expression somber. "Now we're here." Silence stretched between them. Ryan didn't know what to say. A part of him still felt raw, still resented how everything had unraveled. But another part of him, the part that had fallen for her long before he knew her name, couldn't ignore what she had just told him. She was just as much a prisoner of her family's expectations as he was, and maybe, just maybe, she understood him better than anyone ever had. Ryan let out a deep breath and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Jennifer sat across from him, her hands clasped together tightly, as if bracing herself for whatever came next. For the first time since this entire nightmare started, they weren't on opposite sides. They were in this together. Ryan rubbed his temples. "So let me get this straight. You don't want this marriage any more than I do." Jennifer let out a dry laugh. "Not exactly breaking news, Ryan." He smirked despite himself, but quickly sobered. "And yet, if we refuse, we lose everything." Jennifer nodded. "My parents won't disown me, but they'll make my life hell. And yours." Ryan exhaled sharply. "My father will cut me off completely." They sat in silence, the weight of it all pressing down on them. The easiest option would be to just give in, play their parts like good little heirs, and let their families win. But that wasn't who they were. Not anymore. Jennifer straightened, her eyes sharpening with determination. "What if we do it on our own terms?" Ryan frowned. "What do you mean?" She leaned in slightly. "Think about it. Our families want a merger, an alliance. They don't care how we feel about each other, just as long as we stand in front of a room full of people and smile for the cameras. They're expecting resistance from us. But what if, instead of fighting them, we turn the tables?" Ryan studied her, intrigued. "Go on." Jennifer smirked. "We make it our engagement, our wedding, our story. If we're the ones who control the narrative, they can't manipulate it. We announce it before they do, but on our terms. Not as a business deal, but as if—" Ryan raised an eyebrow. "As if we actually chose this?" Jennifer nodded. "Exactly." He leaned back, considering it. It was risky, but it made sense. If they publicly took control of their engagement before their families had the chance to dictate the terms, it would force them to adapt. The press would eat up a story about two heirs choosing love instead of being forced into it. It would make their parents look like the good guys for supporting a decision that, in reality, they had no control over. Jennifer continued, her eyes flickering with excitement. "We set our own rules. A long engagement. Long enough that we can figure things out. We keep our lives separate, our careers separate. We give them what they want, but we don't let them dictate the details." Ryan narrowed his eyes, the plan forming in his mind. "And if they try to interfere?" Jennifer smirked. "Then we remind them that a scandal this big could ruin everything they've worked for." Ryan let out a slow breath, feeling something he hadn't felt in weeks. Control. For the first time since this all began, he wasn't just reacting. He was taking charge. He looked at Jennifer, his lips curving into a slow, confident smile. "All right," he said. "Let's play the game." The next morning, Ryan arrived at the Lancaster estate, his mind clear for the first time in weeks. His parents were expecting him to fall in line, to finally accept his fate without resistance. But they were about to be very, very disappointed. He walked into his father's study, where Charles and Victoria Lancaster were seated, their postures stiff and composed, as if they already knew a battle was coming. His father barely looked up from his newspaper. "I assume you've come to your senses," Ryan exhaled sharply. "That depends on what you mean by sense." Charles finally lowered the paper and leveled him with a calculating gaze. "Meaning?" Ryan met his father's stare without flinching. "I'll marry Jennifer, but on my terms." His mother raised an eyebrow, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Darling, what does that even mean?" "It means," Ryan said evenly, "that this won't be a business merger. It won't be a PR stunt. If I marry Jennifer, it'll be because I choose to, Not because you both decided it for me. His father scoffed, shaking his head. You think you have the luxury of choice? You are not just a man, Ryan. You are a Lancaster. Your life isn't yours alone. It belongs to this family. Ryan clenched his jaw, but he forced himself to remain calm. Then you'll be happy to hear that, as a Lancaster, I've found a way to make this marriage beneficial without becoming a puppet. His mother sighed. And what exactly do you propose? Ryan smirked slightly. A long engagement, one where Jennifer and I remain independent. Our businesses, our careers, our lives. We will not be your next power couple to parade around for the media. His eyes darkened. And if you try to push us, you'll find that a scandalous broken engagement will do far more damage to this family than an independent marriage ever would. His father's expression turned to stone, but he didn't immediately object. That was the thing about Charles Lancaster. He respected leverage. Ryan continued, driving the point home. We announce it first. We control the narrative. Jennifer and I are seen as two heirs who are choosing each other, not being forced together. The press will eat it up, and the public will admire it. But if you try to interfere, if you make us look like pawns, then we walk away, and you lose everything you were hoping for with this deal. For the first time in his life, Ryan watched as his father actually hesitated. His mother pursed her lips before saying, "And Jennifer agrees to this." Ryan gave a slow nod. "She does." There was a long silence before Charles finally leaned back in his chair. His eyes were sharp, unreadable. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Ryan allowed himself a small smirk. "I think I learned from the best." His father studied him for another moment before finally exhaling, as if relenting. "Fine." Ryan hid his surprise. He had expected more resistance, but he knew better than to let his guard down. Victoria gave him a scrutinizing look. "We'll support this for now, but if this little act of yours fails, don't expect us to clean up the mess." Ryan's smirk didn't waver. "Noted." Meanwhile, across the city, Jennifer stood in her father's vast office, facing both of her parents as they regarded her with thinly veiled irritation. "This is absurd," her mother scoffed, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. "You had one job, Jennifer, to marry into the Lancaster family and secure our position. And now you're saying you want to do it your way?" Jennifer lifted her chin, standing her ground. "I'm saying I won't be manipulated." Her father, Richard Sullivan, sighed heavily. "And yet, here you are, still agreeing to marry him." Jennifer's stomach twisted slightly, but she didn't let it show. "Because I chose to, not because you arranged it." Her mother's eyes narrowed. "You think you have control, but you don't. You're still doing exactly what we wanted." Jennifer smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Then why does it feel like I just won?" Her father's lips pressed into a thin line. "You better hope for all our sakes that this plan of yours doesn't fall apart." Jennifer's voice was unwavering. "It won't." She turned and walked out, knowing full well that she had just drawn the first battle line in a war she refused to lose. The fallout was immediate. The Lancaster and Sullivan families were not used to being challenged, especially not by their own heirs. For years, they had controlled every narrative, every move, every decision that shaped their children's futures. But now, for the first time, they weren't in control, and the world was watching. Ryan and Jennifer's engagement, their engagement, not their parents' arrangement, was already spreading across business and society columns. The story was perfectly crafted, just as they had planned. Two heirs from powerful families, choosing love over duty. It was a public relations masterpiece, a story that made the Lancaster and Sullivan families look progressive, forward-thinking, human. If either family tried to backtrack now, if they forced Ryan or Jennifer's hand, it would unravel everything, exposing their true motivations, making them look like nothing more than power-hungry manipulators. They couldn't afford that kind of scandal. Behind closed doors, the tension was suffocating. At the Lancaster estate, Charles Lancaster sat in his office, jaw clenched as he read through the latest media coverage. The headlines were everywhere. A new era of power couples. Ryan Lancaster and Jennifer Sullivan announced their engagement on their own terms. Breaking traditions. How two corporate heirs are choosing love over business. It was exactly what Ryan had planned. Victoria Lancaster placed a crystal glass of whiskey in front of her husband before sitting gracefully across from him. "We could push back," she suggested. "Control the story before it gets out of hand." Charles shook his head slowly, exhaling through his nose. "No, not this time." Victoria raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. "You're really going to let Ryan win?" Her husband's expression darkened. For now, because despite his anger, he had to admit, his son had played this well. At the Sullivan estate, Richard Sullivan was pacing, his irritation barely concealed. "This isn't how it was supposed to happen," he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "They've completely changed the game." Jennifer's mother, Evelyn, sat elegantly on the white leather sofa, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she agreed. "And now, if we interfere, we look like villains." Richard let out a humorless laugh. "And we're just supposed to let them dictate the terms?" Evelyn swirled the wine in her glass before looking up at her husband. "What choice do we have?" She was right, of course. The damage was already done. If they forced Jennifer to follow the original plan, the media would turn on them. The world was too invested in the idea of two heirs choosing love over corporate obligations. Any public interference now would make them look desperate, weak, two things the Sullivan name could never afford. Richard exhaled sharply. "Fine. Let them think they've won." Evelyn took a slow sip of wine before setting her glass down with a small smirk. "For now." Meanwhile, Ryan and Jennifer sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, far away from the watchful eyes of their families. No bodyguards, no reporters, no business executives lurking nearby. Just them. Jennifer tapped her fingers lightly against her coffee cup. "They're not happy," Ryan smirked. "That makes two of us." She let out a soft chuckle before her expression grew more serious. "But they're letting it happen." Ryan nodded, his gaze steady on hers. "For now." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And what about us?" Ryan exhaled slowly. That was the real question, wasn't it? They had won this battle, but their war had only just begun. Their engagement was real in the public eye, but behind closed doors, there was still so much left uncertain. Would they ever truly choose each other? Or had they just created a different kind of cage? Ryan met her gaze, and for the first time since this all started, he gave her the only answer that felt true. "I guess we find out." For the first time, it was real. No more secrets, no more hidden identities, no more pretending they were strangers when, in reality, their fates had been intertwined long before either of them had a say in it. Ryan and Jennifer were engaged, but for the first time they were going to find out if they actually wanted to be. Jennifer leaned against the railing of the rooftop garden, the Manhattan skyline glowing behind her. The air was crisp, a light breeze stirring the strands of hair that had escaped from her loose bun. Ryan stood beside her, hands in his pockets, staring out at the city. It was a stark contrast to the grand galas and high-profile events they were used to. There were no cameras, no flashing lights, no reporters waiting to dissect every move they made. Just them. Jennifer smirked, nudging him lightly with her elbow. "So, Lancaster, what exactly does one do on aerial date when they've spent their entire life going on publicity stunts instead?" Ryan huffed a laugh. "You're assuming I've never been on a real date before?" She arched an eyebrow. "Am I wrong?" He turned to look at her, holding her gaze for a long moment before shaking his head with a smirk. "No, you're not." She laughed, and for the first time since they had met, the weight of their families, their expectations, and the entire world watching them seemed to fade. They had spent so much time fighting, against their families, against their circumstances, against each other. But now, without all of that, they had the one thing they had never had before, a choice. And they were choosing to be here. Late-night conversations. The more time they spent together, the more Ryan found himself wanting to know everything about her. Not the Jennifer Sullivan the world knew, the polished socialite, the business heir, the perfect daughter of a billion-dollar empire. But her, the woman who loved art museums but hated modern abstract pieces. The woman who could argue about coffee blends for an hour but refused to drink tea. The woman who had spent her whole life trying to break free from the golden cage she had been born into. One night, they sat on the floor of Ryan's penthouse, pizza boxes between them, barefoot, laughing about something ridiculous. It was the kind of night that felt normal, something neither of them had ever really experienced before. Jennifer leaned her head back against the couch, glancing at him. Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if we met under different circumstances? Ryan thought about it for a second before shaking his head. No, she frowned. No? He turned his head to look at her, his expression serious now. Because I don't think we ever would have met. Jennifer blinked, caught off guard. Ryan gave a small, almost sad smile. If our parents hadn't done this, we would have lived our lives in the same circles, but never really seen each other. We would have been at the same events, shaken hands, exchanged polite nods, and moved on. You would have been another name in my world, and I would have been another in yours. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. She hated how much that made sense. She exhaled. So in some twisted way, we should be grateful for them? Ryan let out a low chuckle. Let's not go that far. At first, their dates had been an experiment, a way to prove to themselves that they could tolerate each other, that they could make this arrangement work. But soon they weren't just seeing each other because they had to. They were seeing each other because they wanted to. Ryan found himself looking forward to the way Jennifer challenged him, how she didn't back down from an argument, how she could meet him step for step in wit and intelligence, but also let her guard down when it was just the two of them. Jennifer found herself drawn to the way Ryan actually listened to her. He wasn't just another man who saw her as an asset, another trophy wife to be placed in a glass box. He treated her like an equal, someone worth knowing. The lines between obligation and choice, between pretending and reality, started to blur, and neither of them knew what to do about it. Ryan had always known that his life was meant to follow a script, one carefully crafted by his parents, his family's legacy, and the expectations that came with the Lancaster name. But this moment, this was his. For weeks he had been thinking about it. Their engagement had been a calculated move, a way to gain control over their lives before their families could dictate every step. But now it wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about her. It was about the way Jennifer scrunched her nose when she was deep in thought, the way she rolled her eyes whenever he said something cocky but secretly enjoyed it. It was the way she spoke about her dreams, the ones she had hidden for so long because no one had ever bothered to ask. It was about the fact that somewhere along the way, he had stopped pretending, and now he wanted her to choose him, just like he had already chosen her. It wasn't a grand, over-the-top affair. No extravagant dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant, no elaborate gestures orchestrated by a team of professionals. Instead, it was just them. Ryan had taken Jennifer to a quiet little beach house outside the city, far away from the flashing cameras and the polished ballrooms of their world. They had spent the day barefoot in the sand, laughing about everything and nothing at all, watching the waves crash against the shore as the sun set in hues of gold and crimson. And now, as the sky darkened and the salty breeze brushed against their skin, they sat together on the wooden deck, a bottle of wine between them. Jennifer leaned her head back, exhaling softly. I could stay here forever. Ryan glanced at her, his heart pounding harder than it should have been. Now or never. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. But instead of getting down on one knee, instead of making a big spectacle out of it, he simply placed it on the table between them. Jennifer blinked, looking at the box, then up at him. Ryan. He held her gaze, his voice quiet but steady. Marry me. Jennifer let out a small breath, and for the first time she didn't have a quick response. Ryan smirked slightly. I know we're technically already engaged, but I need this to be real. Not because of them. Not because it's expected, because it's us. Jennifer slowly reached for the box, opening it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Not the gaudy, oversized diamonds their parents would have picked. This one was understated, timeless, something meant for her. Her fingers traced the edge of the ring, as she exhaled a quiet laugh. You really thought this through, didn't you? Ryan shrugged, but there was something vulnerable in the way he looked at her. I just want to know that if we do this, it's because we want to. Jennifer stared at the ring for a moment longer before looking up at him. And then she smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Yes, she said softly. Ryan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a slow grin spreading across his face. Jennifer slid the ring onto her finger, tilting her hand slightly as the light caught it. It's perfect, Ryan smirked. I know. She rolled her eyes but leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. And just like that, it was real. The next morning, as they sipped coffee on the porch, Jennifer glanced at Ryan over the rim of her mug. You know our parents are expecting a wedding that looks like a royal coronation, right? She mused. Ryan smirked. Let them expect it. Jennifer raised an eyebrow. You have a plan? Ryan leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out. We do it our way. Small, private, no press, no endless guest list full of people we don't even know. Just us and the people we actually care about. Jennifer studied him for a moment before smiling. I like the sound of that. Ryan reached for her hand, running his thumb gently over her new ring. Good, because this time, we're the ones writing the script. The news of Ryan and Jennifer's real engagement spread faster than either of them anticipated. This time, it wasn't a carefully orchestrated press release approved by their families. It was theirs, a simple announcement, a picture of Jennifer's hand wearing the understated yet elegant ring Ryan had chosen for her, with nothing but the caption, Our way, our story. The reaction was immediate. The public adored it. The media called it a modern love story, two heirs choosing love over legacy. And for once, neither of their families could spin it into something else. Ryan knew exactly what was coming when he arrived at his parents' estate the next morning. Victoria Lancaster was already waiting in the drawing room, her expression poised but unmistakably displeased. Charles stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, his posture stiff. Ryan, his mother began, voice cool, would you care to explain why I had to find out about your engagement from the internet rather than from my own son? Ryan smirked, dropping onto the leather couch like he didn't have a care in the world. Thought it'd be more exciting that way. His father turned, his jaw tight. You think this is a joke? Ryan met his gaze evenly. No, I think it's my life, and I finally get to make my own decisions about it. His mother sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. Darling, no one is saying you can't make decisions, but a wedding of this magnitude is going to be small, private, and exactly what Jennifer and I want, Ryan finished smoothly. Charles Lancaster's expression darkened. That is not how things work in this family. Ryan leaned forward slightly, his smirk fading. Then maybe it's time for things to change. A thick silence filled the room. Victoria exchanged a glance with her husband, as if silently weighing their next move. In the end, Charles exhaled sharply, his face unreadable. Fine, do it your way. Ryan narrowed his eyes. Just like that? His father's voice was clipped. Do not mistake this for approval, Ryan. This is containment. You've already made a spectacle of things. We have no choice but to let you follow through. But don't think for a second that means we'll relinquish all control. Ryan clenched his jaw, already expecting this. Victoria's voice softened as she stood, approaching him with the grace of someone who always knew how to get her way. Darling, you must understand. There are expectations. You and Jennifer are not just two people in love. You are the next generation of two of the most powerful families in this country. Like it or not, your marriage is symbolic. Ryan held his mother's gaze. So what exactly are you asking for? She smiled, smoothing an invisible crease on her sleeve. Let us handle some aspects of the wedding. The guest list, the location, just the things that matter to the family. Ryan scoffed. And by matter, you mean things that make you look good. Victoria merely gave him a knowing smile. A compromise, darling. If you're going to rewrite the rules, at least let us edit them. Ryan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He knew this wasn't a complete win. His parents would never fully let go of their influence, but at least for once he had the upper hand. Meanwhile, at the Sullivan estate, Jennifer sat across from her parents in the grand dining hall, arms crossed as she prepared for the inevitable storm. Richard Sullivan had his hands folded on the table, his expression unreadable. Evelyn sat beside him, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light as she sipped from a delicate glass of wine. "So," her father finally said, breaking the silence, "you went through with it." Jennifer met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," her mother sighed dramatically, setting her glass down. "In the wedding, you plan on having some little bohemian ceremony, I assume?" Jennifer's lips twitched. "That's the idea." Richard leaned back in his chair. "You realize this means the press will see this as a rebellion, don't you?" Jennifer shrugged. Let them. The alternative was being paraded around like a prize horse. "I think we made the right choice." Her father watched her for a long moment before shaking his head. "You and Ryan played this well. I'll give you that." Jennifer arched an eyebrow. "Is that approval?" Her mother scoffed. "Hardly, but it's done, and we can't afford to fight it publicly." Jennifer exhaled slowly. This was what she had expected. Their families never lost, but in this case, acceptance was their only option. Richard Sullivan finally stood, buttoning his jacket. "Do what you want, Jennifer, but don't think for a second that you're outside this family's influence. A Sullivan does not simply fade into the background." Jennifer's smile was sharp. "Then it's a good thing I don't plan on fading at all." Her father gave her one last unreadable look before leaving the room. Her mother sighed and stood as well. "At least let us make sure the guest list is appropriate." Jennifer laughed under her breath. "Of course! Wouldn't want to tarnish the Sullivan reputation." Evelyn smirked, brushing her fingers over the rim of her wineglass. "Darling, the Sullivan name will always hold power. Just make sure you don't forget who you are." Jennifer held her mother's gaze, her expression unreadable. "I haven't forgotten," she said quietly. "I just get to decide what that means now." The wedding day arrived not with the grandeur of a royal affair, not with the suffocating presence of 1,000 guests handpicked by their families, but with simplicity, intimacy, and something real, something that finally belonged to them. It was exactly as they had planned. A private ceremony set in an elegant yet understated vineyard estate just outside the city. The guest list was small, only the people who truly mattered. No politicians, no CEOs using their wedding as an opportunity for networking, no business associates eager to turn their union into a transaction. Just family, real friends, and them. Ryan stood at the altar, hands clasped in front of him, his heart pounding in a way he had never experienced before. He had spent his entire life attending grand affairs, standing in front of crowds, delivering speeches at high-profile events. But this was the first time he actually cared. Then she appeared. Jennifer walked down the aisle, not in a gown dripping with diamonds or designed by the most exclusive haute couture label, but in something simple, timeless, elegantly hers. The moment he saw her, everything else faded. The pressures, the expectations, the legacy they had once fought against, it all melted away. She was his choice just as he was hers. Jennifer met his gaze, and for the first time since they had met, there was no tension, no battle to fight, no games to play. Just them. When she reached him, she smirked slightly. "You look nervous." Ryan exhaled, shaking his head. "Not even close." She raised an eyebrow. "Liar." He chuckled, but his fingers tightened around hers. "You're right. Terrified." Jennifer grinned. "Good." The officiant cleared his throat, smiling at their exchange before beginning the ceremony. Unlike the scripted speeches their parents had likely envisioned for this day, their vows were personal, unscripted, spoken straight from the heart. Ryan looked at Jennifer, his voice steady. "For so long I thought my life was set in stone, that I had no say in my own future. Then I met you." His lips twitched slightly. "Technically, I was supposed to marry you anyway, but that's beside the point." A soft chuckle rippled through the small crowd. Ryan's expression grew more serious. "The truth is, you showed me what it means to fight for something real, to live on my own terms. And more than anything, you made me want something I never thought I'd have, a love that's mine. So I choose you, Jennifer. Not because I have to, Not because it was planned, but because I want to. Jennifer swallowed hard, her usual sharp wit momentarily replaced by something softer, deeper. She took a slow breath before speaking. For most of my life, I've tried to run away from what people expected of me. I thought that if I could just get far enough, I'd finally be free. But what I didn't realize was that freedom isn't about escaping. It's about choosing. And Ryan, I choose you. She squeezed his hands gently. Not because of our families, not because of what anyone expects, but because you're the person I want to stand next to, fight with, and fight for every single day. Ryan's throat tightened, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be overwhelmed by emotion. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur, the exchange of rings, the final words spoken by the officiant, and then, "You may kiss the bride." Ryan didn't hesitate. He cupped Jennifer's face and kissed her, not because it was expected, not because it was part of the script, but because it was real. Their guests erupted into cheers, but for them, the world had shrunk down to just the two of them. The reception was as intimate as the ceremony. No cold, impersonal banquet halls, no tedious speeches from people who barely knew them. Instead, it was warm, lively, and full of laughter. Jennifer danced barefoot on the grass, holding a glass of champagne as she twirled under the string lights. Ryan stood a few feet away, watching her with a look that, weeks ago, he never would have thought himself capable of. "She looks happy," a voice said beside him. Ryan turned to see his mother, Victoria Lancaster, watching Jennifer with an expression that was unreadable, but softer than usual. Ryan nodded. "She is." Victoria glanced at him, tilting her head slightly. "And you?" Ryan smirked before answering. "For the first time in my life, yeah." His mother's lips curved just slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Then I suppose you did something right." Ryan didn't need her approval. But hearing those words, it wasn't the worst thing. As the night wore on, he finally pulled Jennifer into his arms, holding her close as they swayed to the music. Jennifer rested her head against his shoulder, exhaling softly. "You know, for an engagement that started out as a corporate power move, this turned out pretty well." Ryan chuckled. "Yeah, I think so too." Jennifer lifted her head to look at him, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "So now what, Mr. Lancaster?" Ryan grinned. Now we start living." And for once, their future wasn't something controlled by their parents, dictated by their last names, or written in boardroom deals. It was theirs. Months passed, and with them the last remnants of the old expectations that had once bound Ryan and Jennifer like chains. They had done the impossible, not just finding love, but finding freedom. It wasn't easy. Their families still loomed in the background, still tried to exert control, still dropped carefully worded suggestions about how they should manage their marriage, their careers, their futures. But Ryan and Jennifer had learned something invaluable through all of this. They no longer had to listen. Ryan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, sipping his coffee as he watched the city skyline stretch endlessly before him. Except this time, it was his own office, not Lancaster Enterprises, not a division of the Sullivan Empire, but something he and Jennifer had built together. When they had first talked about their future, they had agreed on one thing. They didn't want to be just another generation repeating the same cycle of power plays and control. So they broke away. They took their wealth, their connections, their skills, and forged their own path. A consulting firm, independent from their families, advising rising businesses that actually needed guidance, not just conglomerates looking to expand their dominance. It was new, bold, and entirely theirs. Jennifer walked into the office, tossing a file onto his desk. "Our newest client, a startup fashion label in Paris. They want help expanding to the U.S." Ryan smirked. "And let me guess, you already love their designs?" Jennifer shrugged playfully. "Well, if we're going to help companies, might as well be ones that don't bore me to death." Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. He loved watching her like this, in her element, making decisions on her own terms. She leaned against his desk, crossing her arms. "You realize our parents still think this is just a phase, right?" Ryan smirked, setting his coffee down. "Let them." Jennifer grinned, tilting her head. "You enjoy this, don't you?" Ryan stood, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her in. What, proving them wrong? He leaned in, brushing his lips against hers. Every damn day. Jennifer laughed softly before kissing him, their world narrowing down to just the two of them. They still bore the Lancaster and Sullivan names. They still had the weight of their legacies behind them. But for the first time, those names didn't define them. They weren't just heirs. They weren't just the carefully groomed successors to dynasties they never wanted. They were Ryan and Jennifer, partners, equals, two people who had once been trapped in a world they never chose, but who had rewritten their own story. One evening, they found themselves back at the Brooklyn bar where it all began. Jennifer sat on a bar stool, watching as Ryan leaned over the counter, examining the shelves of liquor like a professional. I still can't believe you never learned how to mix a proper drink, Jennifer teased. Ryan smirked, grabbing a bottle. I wasn't exactly allowed to waste time on hobbies. He poured a glass, admittedly, poorly, and slid it toward her. For old time's sake? Jennifer lifted the glass, studying it for a moment before taking a sip. She winced slightly. Yeah, no, you're terrible at this. Ryan laughed, shaking his head. Good thing I don't need a backup career. Jennifer set the glass down and leaned in, her expression softening. You know, the first time you walked in here, I thought you were just another rich guy looking for an escape. Ryan tilted his head. And now? She smirked. Now I know you were looking for something real, even if you didn't realize it yet. Ryan reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. And I found it. Jennifer squeezed his hand. So did I. They weren't running anymore. They weren't fighting anymore. They had finally stepped into a life that was truly theirs. One they had built, one they had chosen. And for the first time, they were free.